Camus' The Fall is a clever short story. The Plague is one of the best pieces of prose of the era. It's why Camus won the Nobel for Literature, I would think. He was killed in a car crash in Algeria while fairly young, and a loss for good reading. Existentialism, wrote Sartre, is a continuation of French rationalism. I've read the books on your list and should point out that you may go toward the excellent choice of further readings in classical Russian literature, although you may choose to skip Anna Karenina, read a little retro into the European Far Western tradition, and then work toward the present. Hermann Hesse also won a Nobel for Literature. His work may be regarded as existentialist in some respects. His post-war reconstructions are excellent. Not the children of men sort of thing, yet excellent. Perhaps Americans interpret everything within their own paradigm of historical experience and lack enough background of how Europeans and others experience it to place existentialism within an historical perspective. Even Sartre's Being and Nothingness and Critique of Dialectical Reason occur within an historical context that he abstracted as personal and subjective experience of others. One has an opportunity in youth to read the good novels and philosophical works and then must get a real job. The Idiot is a very enjoyable book. Prince Mishkin is a mildly retarded prince who views the world as a poor relative. Russians had much nobility that were virtually landless. I used to think of George W. Bush as Prince Mishkin, elevated to being czar, yet of course GW was a Harvard and Yale grad and very rich. This book isn't very existentialist, it's more fine prose with historical cultural insights on 19th century Russia. Try Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, The Sickness Unto Death, and Stages in Life's Way. Or if you want more of the World War II era neo-decadent chic, just read Sartre's freedom novels, such as The Age of Reason. Generally, those are about the period of French mobilization. If you haven't read Sartre's plays, they are de rigueur for an existential synopsis. His short story, The Condemned of Altoona, is also excellent for the Spanish Civil War. Nikolai Gogol is another brilliant Russian short story writer. It is useful to place Dostoevsky within an historical and cultural setting. Russian authors were subject often to censorship and exile during the era of the Tsars. Chekhov also wrote good short stories well worth reading. Although it may seem far afield from Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn's novel, The Cancer Ward, is the most Dostoevsky-like novel I've read. It is set in the late 1950s and was also censored in Russia after a brief initial release. Solzhenitsyn's August 1914 provides an interesting point of view on the fall of the Tsar's military to Prussia, Germany, and is well written. Russian writers had a sense of land and loyalty that transcends some of the political and social temporal aspects of life. Perhaps because of the autocracy of the Tsar, such musings were a field that substituted readily for politics. Marxism and communism were Western imports to Russia that weren't too well suited for the natural northern communitarianism required historically for survival. Russia also had a history of foreign invaders, and the natural communitarianism was repressed by the Tsar and Marxists. The Soviet period was initially like rebuilding a football team from the ground up with a new plan after the old regime had collapsed and left town. Obviously, they had bad coaches and a bad game plan like the Dallas Cowboys of today. The Cowboys have an owner that won't draft a number one quarterback and will continue to be a second-rate team until they draft their own Peyton Manning. I think what I liked about The Fall was the description of social corruption and determinism within a setting of mystery. Obviously, it hasn't the literary quality of The Plague. Neither was it good as Faust. It is a more existential consideration of the problems of life in that era of Europe. It reminds me a little of Steinbeck's analysis of human nature in The Winter of Our Discontent. In a way, though Steinbeck's is much better, good novels, of course, differ from good works of philosophy. Van Crevel's The Culture of War noted that Sartre's Nausea, written when he was a professor at La Havre College before the war, is a social reflection of boredom, halted when the war developed and excitement could again recur as the culture of war expressed itself. Sartre became a German prisoner of war after the French defenses fell, a stimulus for writing about social phenomenalism. In some ways, the American culture of war was stimulated by 9/11 and by the junta of the Bush administration, forgotten with Democratic yells of election stealing from Al Gore in Florida, hushed by the Arab oil financed destruction of the World Trade Towers in New York City. To get an insight into the role that the culture of war plays in society and history, I recommend Van Creveld's book. Van Creveld noted the historical evolution of works of history and literature combined in Thucydides and pure military history did not develop until fairly late, such as after Frederick Barbarossa, when the evolution of military tactics required a more rigorous methodological treatment. Until reading Van Creveld's book, I really hadn't an idea of the fairly recent separation of literature from literature history, such as the Iliad, and the spinning off of academic literature from military history. The World as Will and Idea is a somewhat odd book. Fundamentally, it is a kind of idealism. It may be better to skip to the Fourfold Roots of Reason. That book is to Schopenhauer as a prologue meant to any future metaphysics is to Kant. Schopenhauer is somewhat of an expositor of Kant with a new vision, and his book's introduction is properly arrogant and unhappy with the establishment for being overlooked. Schopenhauer has a rather bizarre mysticism laying beyond his worldly philosophy. He is a little bit of a Zoroastrian and believes that life is rather doomed, therefore is fundamentally illusory and evil, if I have that right. The Fourfold Roots of Reason is more epistemological and has interesting ideas about perception. Many are unfortunately discontented today with Kantian categories, and I must say that the Neo-Platonist Plotinus and the Enneads is still the best mystical philosophical construction available.